Many people believe this is the most common reading of the account of Noah and the ark and the flood, that Noah took two of every kind of land animal on the earth into the ark. And it is caused endless debate. How could he have done it? He can't have done it. Therefore, the account never happened. Oh, yes, he could if he just took, did certain things, took young animals, so on and so forth. And what I want to show you, if you'll just give me 10 or 15 minutes of your time, is that the Bible doesn't really teach that. All those arguments about how could Noah have taken all the animals in the world, samples of them on the ark, really do not matter, because the text, once you really look at the Hebrew and see what it's saying, and the English translations, really a lot of them are awful here. You can't get what it's really saying just by looking at that. So I want to go back and show you in some key verses, just that one narrow aspect. I'm saying that the church has got the narrative of early Genesis wrong because they didn't listen to Jesus. That's my overall thing. Jesus said in John 5:46 that Moses wrote about him, and wrote about him so much so that if you didn't believe in him, then you didn't really understand or believe Moses either. That's just how much that narrative is speaking of Christ and his work. And so it's a long process. I'm starting sort of in the middle of those first 12 chapters of Genesis and showing just one narrow aspect, how we got it wrong. And I'm afraid that the temptation is going to be, and I haven't started talking about why it's wrong yet, so my 10 or 15 minutes doesn't start until I finish the intro here, please. But there are two different mindsets on this that have got themselves in a condition where they can't process information. They can't be reasonable and consider things. And one is what I would call the misinformation or the bad theology merry-go-round. And if someone's on the bad theology merry-go-round, they have a systematic idea of what the text is saying. They can't just look at one narrow thing and separate it from what they believe the rest of the text is saying. They interpret everything that's in front of them in the light of their system, even if what's happening there doesn't make sense within their system. And so instead of viewing it as a red flag that maybe they're misunderstanding the text, they just say, oh no, I know that can't be right. I know X can't be right because of A, B, C, D, and E. And so then you go and you show them A. Well, you know what? You don't have A right either because your system needs adjusting. Your whole system needs adjusting. And what I'm trying to show you about X is just a sign to you that that's the case. And they can't say, no, you got to be wrong about X. Never mind what you're saying about X. But because of what I know about A, you've got to be wrong. Well, you go show them A, and they say, no, that can't be right either because I know what B is saying. That can't. So you go to B and say, no, here's where you're misunderstanding B. Oh, that can't be right because I've got. And you just continue on this bad systemic theology merry-go-round. You just go chasing them around. They never settle down and just look at one verse of Scripture in detail and really try to meditate on it and understand what they're saying. They keep interpreting everything in the light of their system, and you can't break through because they won't discuss any verse in depth. They just take 10 points that are in line with their system, and you keep chasing them around, and you never get to the end. So that's one problem. That's one hindrance so that people can't see what Jesus Christ told people about Genesis, and Moses. He's writing about him. And the other group, and these are the two Christians, but then in the second group, there's a lot of unbelievers in it too. The idea that Genesis could be history is just so ridiculous to them that they can't process anything that contradicts that idea. They too have a system as well. And their system is that, well, it's myth, it's a spiritual story, it's a borrowed account from other Near Eastern peoples that God somehow used if they're a believer. And the idea that, no, it actually is history, but we've just been getting the narrative wrong, and then what it's really saying makes total sense. It's not contradicted by history. It's not contradicted by what we've learned about the natural world. It's something that there's no good reason why it couldn't have actually happened. They can't accept that because they also have that's connected to a bunch of other ideas that early Genesis can't be history. And so if you're in one of those two categories, I'm asking you to hop off the bad systemic theology merry-go-round and just listen to what I'm saying about this one issue. This one issue. Do the scriptures really teach that that Noah took every animal, types of every animal on the world, from a kangaroo to a giraffe to a grizzly bear or any kind of bear, and all those animals, they were on the ark. Does the Bible really teach that? And if I can show you that it doesn't really teach that, then it's supposed to be a red flag where you are able to then reconsider, gee, have I been looking at this wrong systemically? And then maybe perhaps consider the Christ-centered model that I talk about in my book. So that's the idea. So we're going to start, and I'm going to start way back in chapter 1 and 2 so that we can see how terms are used, terms that describe kinds of animals in early Genesis. Let's start there. I think my 10 to 15 minutes, I can now say it's begun. This is Genesis chapter 1, verse 25. I'm using interlinear translation that I've got from BibleHub.com. Really use it a lot. Good research site. And it's got the English, and of course Hebrew is from right to left, so it looks backwards to us. But I've got the English phrase there, and then it's got the Hebrew words, and then an English pronunciation of the Hebrew words, and then the Strong's Concordance number for that word, the sort of the root word of that word or phrase. So it says, and made God, and he's going to list 3 categories here of creatures. I want you to keep in mind the 3 categories of creatures he's talking about. One is the Hayat Ha'ires, which just is, or Hayat, which just means the beasts of the earth is what it says here, because Eretz means earth or land. And you don't know which one it means until you get context. Here I think we can assume it means all the land. It means the planet. But the beasts of the earth, that word beast, hayat, it literally just means living thing. It's a living creature. So it's used here as sort of a catch-all phrase. It's wild animals is one way they think of it, but really it's all the animals that have the breath of life that don't fit into these other 2 categories that are going to be named. Because it is the phrase is not very descriptive. It just means living things. It could apply to all living creatures, but it doesn't here. It's because they're separating it out into 3 different categories. So one of which is the wild animals, according to its kind, and livestock, and the Hebrew root word there is behema, and a behema is more properly a dumb beast, not like a dog or a cat that will talk to you or a monkey, but it's more like a cow or a horse, a 4-legged creature that probably vegetarian, that just lumbers along, and it's not. It's more suitable for domestication than the previous category. It's the animals that are important to us because we domesticate them, and they are a bigger part of our lives. So it's translated cattle in some versions, like the King James has this word cattle. So it's got wild animals, livestock, or cattle, and it's broader than cattle in truth. But that's the kind of animal it is. Even though it can technically be used, people use it as shorthand just to mean any kind of animal or all animals. More properly, that's the kind of animal it is. According to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind. Now, that remes there, that where I've got that red arrow pointing down, that is a word that really just speaks of a kind of motion. Anything that's moving could be a remes, but when it's talking about creeping on the earth, or the ha'adama, ha'adama means the ground, the physical dirt that's down there. And usually, it usually has connotations of sort of the open field or ground suitable for cultivation, in fact, because, yes, Adam is taken from that same word, just as Adam was taken from the earth. But remas ha'adama is something that moves along the earth, slithering around like a snake, scurrying along like a lizard, the small stuff like that. So we have three categories here in Genesis 1:25 that God created: the beasts of the earth, which is the live, wild type animals, the livestock, the type that is suitable for domestication as a, you might say, dumb, lumbering quadruped, and then the small stuff that creeps on the ground. And that, pay attention to these three categories, please, as we go on. Now let's move to Genesis chapter 2 and see what sort of animals God created in the garden. And now we'll go to Genesis 2:19, and I want to throw 20 in with it here, but I've got 2:19 up. And formed Yahweh God out of the ground every beast of the field. Now, hayat is the word translated beast here. Again, there's some flexibility. It means living thing. Beast of the field is not beast of the earth. That's not eretz. It's hasada. It's speaking of ground capable of cultivation or feeding livestock like a pasture. So this is a more limited set of animals than is spoken of in chapter 1. Now in chapter 1, hayat means the wild animals because it then takes pains to describe a second group that God made, the behema, which is tame animals. But if we go to the next verse, verse 20 in chapter 2 of Genesis, then we see that Adam names the behema. He names the cattle, and he names the birds, and he names every living beast of the field. And again, it has the same term, hayat hasada. And so there it's using hayat as all the living creatures that are in this biome, not the planet, but the field of the garden, of the cultivated ground that Adam is tending, not the mountains, not the forest, civilized ground. So it's a smaller group of animals. Some things in it we will see fall in the category of creeping things as beasts of the field or living things of the field, and others are like the cattle and pigs and horses and things of that nature. So this is chapter 2. There he's using hayat as a broader term that includes behema and includes creeping things, but it's only of the field, living things of the field, and not everything. Now let's go to Genesis chapter 6. And this is right after God tells Noah that he's going to wipe out every living thing, that there's going to be he needs to bring every living creature into the ark, but then he qualifies that by giving a specific list. So if I say, I want you to bring in everything, and then I follow that with a list of categories to bring, then what I'm meaning is everything on that list. And so 6:19, he says, I want you to gather up everything that I'm going to send to you. But in verse 20, he qualifies that by giving a list of creatures, of the birds after their kind, and of animals after their kind. But what word is used for animals? It's behema again. It's the livestock kind. That's the kind that's used of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth, again of the ha-adama. So this is a category of creatures that move along the ground. It's small stuff. After its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to be kept alive. So it's the ones that come to him. He doesn't even have to go out and collect them, per se. And some he may already have with him. He may even already have some wild animals with him, because if he has dogs and cats, they would not be behema. They would be hayat erets, wild animals of the land or earth. So that's a category that's missing here in 620. The only, yes, take birds, yes, take the creeping things, the small stuff, but the only category of large animals that he's told to take is the behema. Not the same categories as in Genesis chapter 1. Go back, stop the video, and go back and look at what I showed in 125. There's a missing category here. This isn't all the animals in the world. This is the animals that correspond to the animals in chapter 2, the smaller set. Okay? Behema, suitable for livestock, those are beasts of the field, not beasts of the earth. And the creeping things of the Adama, once again, that's more corresponds more to the field rather than, say, the mountains or the forest or any part of the world besides ground capable of cultivation from which Adam got his name. So this list, when you look at it in the Hebrew, even though they're translating a word here that the King James translated this same word behema as cattle in chapter 1, and now they're translating it as animals. That's not good translation, folks. If you see it, you realize, wait a minute, there's some things missing on this list. Well, they're not missing. It's all the ones that God created in chapter 2 for Adam, and that smaller group. Because what Genesis and the flood account is really about is preserving the line of Messiah. That's why Adam was brought to this world. That's why the creatures that were put with him, that's all a part of God's plan that will lead to the redemption of mankind. So if the line of Messiah gets wiped out, even if the flood is not global, the consequences of the flood are global. The world will go to ruin. The whole world will go to ruin. It will never be redeemed. There will be no Messiah to deliver the earth. And that is what's at stake here. And I'm really going to narrow my topic to, was every animal on the ark now? But some of these other verses where it just seems like God's saying he'll destroy everything, there's really two different things happening there. And there's more about it in the book. It's not what I want to focus on here. But what I want you to see here is this list is missing something if it really was supposed to be every kind of animal in the world. And let's go on, because God tells Noah to do something. Then the Lord tells Noah to do something that is not contradictory to this, but it's not quite the same either. Let's look in chapter 7. So here we see the first part of chapter 7, and this is the Lord telling Noah what to put into the ark. And he gives slightly different instructions, not just 2 of every animal, but this time he says 7 pairs of clean and 1 pair of unclean animals. And I say animals, but I want you to look at the Hebrew. Of every behema, of every that kind of animal, the domestic kind of animal, the big lumbering mute beasts that are suitable for domestication, of every behema, clean, you shall take with you 7, male and female, and of animals, but it's behema, not clean, 2 each, a male and a female. Now, he mentions the birds outside of this, but he never mentions the creeping things. In other words, what the Lord tells Noah and what God tells Noah, slightly not contradictory instructions, not conflicting instructions, but they're different instructions. This one is very focused on having animals of the clean type. And by the way, that means that, the law of Moses codified what was already known and revealed about animals. This was long before Moses, yet they had clean and unclean animals. But the law of Moses codified what was known. So he wanted that extra animal, kind of a hint to know what a sacrifice one, because and it's more clean than unclean. So again, this is not even concerned about the creeping things. It's really just concerned about the birds and these bigger domesticated animals. But that doesn't mean he ignores them. He takes them because God had told him earlier, you take of the animals that crawl along the ground too, the creeping things. And again, if he has dogs and cats, if he has a predatory animal that has been domesticated, that would even be hayat erets, because even though they're not on this list, you would still take your family dog, you would still take your family cat. They're not even on this list, but you wouldn't have to take every animal like that in the world. You don't need gorillas, you don't need bears, you don't need elephants. You just have the ones that they had, that they were given in chapter 2 to help make a paradise. So this is going to continue on, and next let's take a look. This is what was brought onto the ark. That and what we see in chapter 6. What was destroyed? Because you may be saying, well, they're using that behemoth as animal generally, and by this point of the story, they've changed the way they categorize things, and they're just not categorizing them like they did back in Genesis 1. So, Mark, you're all wet here because they've given up that way of looking at things. No, that's not true. Let's go this further on in the same chapter, and let's see what Shem, Ham, and Japheth report. And that's who is reporting here. This is later in chapter 7. It's not God speaking. It's Shem, Ham, and Japheth reporting what they saw. Okay, but let's see what they saw later in Genesis chapter 7. So some might be tempted to think, well, you're being too particular with the language, Mark. When he said take behemoth and creeping things in chapter 6, or when the Lord said just behemoth in chapter 7, it really doesn't mean that much, because that can still kind of mean all the animals. Maybe they just forgot about the other two categories, or it fell out of common usage by the time you get to chapter 6 and 7. Well, that's not true. Here we are in chapter 7, verse 21. They use the same categorization as is used in Genesis chapter 1. There's got the birds, they've got the behemoth, they've got the hayat, they've got the creeping things. So they've got the livestock, the wild animals, and the creeping things, along with birds. Hasn't changed from Genesis chapter 1. This in verse 21, this is a list of things that were destroyed in the flood, according to Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Verse 14 is what they took onto the ark, according to Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And I'm saying this because I think it's important to note that God is not the narrator in this account. You go a little further, you go at the end of the flood account, after it's all over, it says, these are the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that's a Toledoth phrase. It means the account of those fellows. This was their story. It's a true story, but it's not, God is not the narrator. When it records that God said something, I believe that's what God said. But it's not his perspective, it's their perspective. And they thought it was a global flood. And so, even though we just went back and saw it, God did not tell them to take the wild animals onto the ark. But verse 14 of chapter 7 says they did anyway. To them, the flood was total. And so I'm not arguing that they don't believe that the flood was total. To them, it was total. And the sort of language they use indicates that. But see, they went beyond what God had said. They weren't taking any chances. They know what he said. God said one thing, the Lord said something else, and they just took everything they could think of, every category of animal, the same three. You look at 7:21, and this is the same 3 in verse 14. In the top left, it's Behemoth again. And of course, before that is birds. In the bottom right, it's the Hayat. That's the wild animals. And then the creeping things. In this case, creeps on the earth. Why not just creeps on the ground like Genesis chapter 1 says? Maybe they were expanding it to everything, or maybe, I think the earth does have some evolutionary power, and maybe God started with the creeping things on the ground and they spread to other biomes by the time we get to Noah and the flood. God, in chapter 1, he commanded the earth to bring forth living creatures. So really, the biblical perspective is the earth can bring forth living creatures. I'm not anti-evolution, I'm pro-creation. There is a difference. But that's not the topic of this video tonight. The point of this video, my point here, is that the same terminology used in Genesis chapter 1 to cover all the categories of animals is used in chapter 7. So God really did give a short list. He really did leave the wild beasts off the list. Now, they included them anyway. They weren't taking any chances. To them, it seemed like was a global flood, and if they wanted any of these animals to survive it, they better take them. But you know what? God knew better. He knew it wasn't a global flood. That's why he didn't bother to command them to take the wild animals. He knew they would survive in other places. And so they may have taken all they knew about. But did they know about pandas in China, kangaroos in Australia, lemurs in Madagascar, monkeys in the Amazon rainforest? No, they didn't know all that. But they took what wild animals they had. They weren't taking any chances. God said to bring a bunch of stuff. Slightly before the flood, the Lord said bring 7 pairs instead of just 2 of the clean ones. You know what? If in doubt, bring it. So they brought it. And they noted that these things got destroyed in the land, which is the Eretz. It says, and died all flesh that moved on the earth. That ha-Eretz, the earth. That can mean land or it can mean world. And you have to use the context to figure it out. I think the context is God has already told them they only have to bring 2 of the 3 categories of animals. So he knows it's not a global flood, and they don't. But to them, it's the world. But to him, it's not. But it's fitting. It's fitting that they think it's everything, because the flood is about purifying God's people. Baptism, according to Peter, is supposed to point back to the flood. And that's not when the unbelievers get killed. It's when that which is impure in us is submitted to God's judgment, knowing that because of the work of Christ, we'll be protected. That which is in us, which he has renewed, will be protected, even if the old man is wiped out. So that's how he used the flood to establish his covenant, his real covenant, his covenant in Christ. But I want to point something out to you here. I think I've made the case that God is not acting like this is a global flood. And he never told them to bring the wild animals, even though they brought them. He didn't tell them to, because he knew it wasn't a global flood. But it's understandable why they should think so. It's proper for them to believe that in the context of purifying God's people. But I want you to look at the very last part there, the lower left. It's got the red square around it. And it says, and every man. How far can we take this stuff, Mark, where you're saying it wasn't a global flood, it was a local flood, would have had global consequences? Because if the line of Messiah had been cut off, if the works that God did in chapter 2, and my position is those works were made to bring redemption to the larger work in chapter 1, including line of Messiah. If that had been destroyed, if those works had been destroyed, the world would have gone to ruin. So it doesn't matter if the flood wasn't global in extent. It would have been global in consequences. There would have been no Messiah. The world would just go to utter ruin and rot. But looking at that red square there says, and every man, that's what they say the English says, but notice that word there. It's not Adam, it's ha-Adam. Just like ha-Eretz in the line above it, and slightly to the right, means the earth or the land. Ha-Adam means the man or the men, or of man or of men, or if it's literally, it's of Adam. In other words, you cannot tell from this verse that every human being in the world died. Now, you say, well, I know some other verses about that. Well, I'm not talking about those tonight, but I'm talking about in this particular verse, you can't tell whether that's saying all men, and if it was saying that, it should not have the ha there. It should just say, we call Adam, and every man. It doesn't. It says, and every the men, or all of Adam. And so I submit to you that some of you think that this is proof that every human being not on the ark died in the flood. I'm saying there may be other verses that suggest that, but you really cannot tell. You cannot make that call based on the Hebrew in this verse. So, but that is beyond the scope of this question. This video was about were all the land animals on the ark? And I think the answer that we've determined here is no. All the animals that Shem, Ham, and Japheth thought existed were on the ark, but God didn't even tell them to bring that many. They brought more than they had to because God knew the flood was not global. I've gone over time. I appreciate your patience, and I thank you for listening. I pray that you consider these things carefully. May God bless you.